In the amberlit haze of the Sapphire Lounge, the rule for the staff was a survival mantra. Be a ghost, be a machine, and never, under any circumstances, look the man at the VIP table in the eye. Zuri lived by this rule. She had spent years mastering the art of invisibility, her rich, warm skin blending into the velvet shadows of the room, her presence as unobtrusive as the scent of the expensive bourbon she served. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The air felt thick, charged with the heavy ozone of an approaching storm. At the heart of that storm sat Kang Dashik. His jet-black hair was slicked back with lethal precision, and his dark, narrow eyes held a calculating coldness that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. As Zuri leaned in to clear a stray glass, a sudden, jarring laugh from a nearby patron caused her hand to slip. A single drop of deep red wine splashed onto Dashik's pristine white cuff, stark as a bloodstain. The lounge went dead. The jazz piano seemed to flatline as Dashik's lead enforcer shifted, his tattooed hand twitching toward the shadow of his jacket. Zuri didn't flinch. Instead, she set her silver tray down with a soft, steady click, reached into her vest, and produced a clean linen cloth. She didn't wait for permission. She reached for his wrist, her fingers momentarily brushing the cold metal of his gold watch. "Red wine is patient, Mr. Kang. If you let it sit, it claims the fabric," she said, her voice a calm, melodic silk that cut through the suffocating silence. For the first time, the head of the Syndicate looked up. His intense, unreadable gaze met hers, and the world outside the lounge ceased to exist. The familiar scent of vanilla orchid and polished wood usually acted as Zuri's anchor, a reminder of the boundaries she had built to stay safe. But as Dashik's eyes tracked the movement of her throat while she spoke, the air in the lounge grew thin. Her hands, usually as steady as a surgeon, felt a foreign tremor as she stepped back. It wasn't just the memory of his gaze that haunted her. It was the way the silence now followed her, a vacuum that had sucked the safety out of her invisibility and left her standing directly in the light. The Sapphire Lounge breathed with a life of its own, a heavy, rhythmic pulse of low-register bass and the clink of crystal that Zuri had learned to dance to without ever being seen. To the men in tailored wool and the women draped in shimmering silk, she was less than a person. She was a shifting shadow, a ghost in a black vest who anticipated a need before it was even felt. She moved through the crowded floor with a liquid grace, her peripheral vision cataloging every half-empty glass and every impatient tilt of a head. Her invisibility was a masterpiece of her own making. In the city's chaotic heart, she had found that the safest place to be was in plain sight, yet completely forgotten. She kept her chin at a precise angle, her eyes fixed on a point 3 inches above the tables, and her voice modulated to a tone that disappeared into the ambient noise the moment she stopped speaking. It was a lonely art, but it was effective. It kept the ghosts of her past at bay, and the predatory gazes of the city's elite sliding right off her skin. Tonight, the lounge was a sea of high-stakes whispers and expensive cologne. Zuri glided toward the corner booth, her silver tray balanced on the tips of her fingers like a natural extension of her arm. She didn't need to look at the patrons to know the temperature of the room was dropping. The usual boisterous laughter of the junior executives had been replaced by a stiff, reverent hush. She approached the table with her usual clockwork precision. She set down the fresh bottle of sparkling water, her movements silent and efficient. She began to reach for the discarded napkins, her mind already 3 steps ahead to the service station. Then the world stalled. The man at the center of the booth didn't move, yet Zuri felt the sudden, crushing weight of his attention. It wasn't the casual, dismissive glance of a customer. It was a heavy, predatory focus that anchored her to the floor. For the first time in years, the ghost felt solid. She felt his gaze move from the hem of her vest to the line of her throat, tracking the slight, involuntary skip of her pulse. Slowly, deliberately, Zuri let her gaze drift upward. She broke her own cardinal rule. Kang Dashik was watching her. His eyes were like polished obsidian, dark, depthless, and terrifyingly intelligent. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply studied her with a terrifying intensity, as if he were peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed armor to see the trembling girl beneath. In that singular, frozen moment, Zuri's invisibility shattered. The art of being a shadow failed her completely. The predator had found his mark, and the safety of the dark was gone forever. The days that followed were defined by a new, agonizing awareness. Every time the heavy mahogany doors of the Sapphire Lounge swung open, Zuri felt a prickle of static against her skin. She tried to retreat into the familiar rhythm of her work, the polishing of silverware, the steady weight of the tray, the calculated silence, but the sanctuary of her invisibility had been breached. She was no longer a ghost, she was a target. Dashik didn't return with the thunderous arrival of a syndicate boss. He returned like a shadow stretching across a room. He appeared on Tuesday, then Thursday, and again on Saturday, always claiming the same corner booth that offered a panoramic view of the floor. He never arrived with a rowdy entourage, only the silent, stone-faced Ryu Sang men who stood like a sentinel just out of the light. Dashik never ordered more than a single glass of neat whiskey, and he never looked at the menu. His only demand was her presence. "Table 4, the floor manager would whisper, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and nerves. "He's asking for you specifically, Zuri." Each encounter was a masterclass in psychological pressure. Zuri would approach, her movements stiffening despite her best efforts. As she set his drink down, Dashik wouldn't speak. He simply watched her hands. He watched the way her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as she cleared his glass. He was studying her, cataloging her reactions like a scientist observing a rare specimen. The tips began on the third night. When Zuri went to clear the table after he departed, she didn't find the usual stack of bills. Instead, resting on the white linen was a single, heavy gold cufflink shaped like a dragon's coil. It was worth more than 3 months of her rent. "Mr. Kang forgot this," Zuri told her manager, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He didn't forget it," the manager replied, refusing to touch the object. "He left it for you. Keep it or throw it away, but don't bring it to me. I don't want to be part of whatever game he's playing." On the 5th night, it was a silk handkerchief, deep crimson and smelling of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. On the 6th, a delicate silver fountain pen with her initials, Z.B., already engraved into the cap. He was proving that her invisibility had been a lie. He knew her name, he knew her movements, and he was slowly replacing her world with pieces of his own. As she stood in the locker room at the end of her shift, clutching the silk handkerchief, Zuri realized the gifts weren't payments. They were markers. Like a predator marking its territory, Kang Dashik was systematically claiming every inch of her life, one luxury item at a time. The golden cage was being built around her, and for the first time, Zuri realized she didn't know how to run from a man who had already seen her soul. The air in the Sapphire Lounge usually tasted of expensive smoke and safety, but tonight, the atmosphere was curdled. Zuri felt it in the way the shadows seemed to stretch too long across the velvet carpet, and the way the ice in her shaker rattled with a frantic, uneven rhythm. Kang Dashik was in his usual booth, his presence a cold weight at the edge of her vision. He wasn't looking at his drink. He was looking at the entrance, his jaw set in a line of hard, tempered steel. The violence didn't start with a shout. It started with the silence of the music cutting out. The jazz piano died mid-chord, replaced by the heavy, mechanical slide of a side door being kicked open. Before Zuri could even turn her head, the front windows of the lounge disintegrated. Shards of reinforced glass rained down like diamonds, glittering under the amber lights before the first roar of gunfire tore the sophisticated piece to shreds. Screams erupted, a chaotic symphony of terror that Zuri felt in her very marrow. She dove behind a marble pillar, her silver tray clutched to her chest like a useless shield. Through the haze of plaster dust and cordite, she saw them, masked men in tactical gear, moving with the lethal efficiency of a cleaning crew. They weren't there for the money. They were there for the head of the Syndicate. "Dashik!" One of the gunmen roared, the muzzle flash of his rifle illuminating the carnage. Zuri expected to see Dashik running. Instead, she saw the world tilt. Ryu Sang Men appeared out of the smoke like a vengeful spirit, his weapon barking as he cleared a path toward the corner booth. But he wasn't looking for an exit for his boss. He was looking for her. Before Zuri could scramble toward the service stairs, A massive, gloved hand clamped around her upper arm with the force of an iron vice. It was one of Dashik's personal guards. He didn't say a word. He simply yanked her upward, her feet barely touching the floor as he dragged her toward the center of the crossfire. "Let me go," she gasped, her voice lost in the thunder of another volley of shots. She caught a glimpse of Dashik standing amidst the chaos, his white shirt splattered with a crimson that wasn't wine. He wasn't fleeing. He was waiting for her. As the guard swung her toward the rear exit, Zuri's fingers lost their grip on the silver tray. Time seemed to liquefy. She watched, paralyzed, as the tray hit the floor. It didn't clatter. It hissed as it slid through a growing pool of dark, visceral red. It spun in a slow, mocking circle, catching the flickering light of the lounge one last time. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging her into the cold darkness of the alleyway, the image of that tray, once her anchor, now a discarded relic of a life that was officially over, burned into her mind. The silence was the first thing that terrified her. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the lounge or the ringing vacuum that follows a gunshot. It was a sterile, absolute quiet that felt miles away from the world of living things. Zuri opened her eyes to a ceiling of brushed slate and the soft, rhythmic hum of a climate control system she couldn't see. She was lying on a bed that felt like a cloud of spun silk, the sheets cool and impossibly smooth against her skin. Gone was the starched, blood-stained white shirt of her shift. In its place, she wore a robe of charcoal satin that felt like a second, more expensive skin. As she sat up, the room's floor-to-ceiling glass walls tinted automatically, shifting from opaque frost to a dizzying view of the city's skyline, far above the neon haze of the streets she knew. This was a fortress of glass and gravity. "The disorientation will pass," a voice said, cutting through the stillness. Kang Dashik sat in a low-slung leather chair by the window, a tablet in his hand, and a glass of amber liquid on the table beside him. He had traded his tactical gear for a clean white shirt, the collar open to reveal the dark ink of a dragon's tail coiling up his neck. He looked revitalized, while Zuri felt as though she were held together by fraying thread. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need to go home, the police, the lounge." "The lounge is a crime scene, and your apartment has already been cleared," Dashik said, his tone as flat and final as a gavel. He stood and walked toward her, his movements possessing a predatory grace that made the expansive room feel suddenly very small. "To the world below, Zuri, you died in the crossfire. A waitress caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unidentified, unclaimed, and buried in the paperwork of a gang war." Zuri felt the blood drain from her face. "You can't just, I have a life, I have people." "You had invisibility," he corrected, stopping at the edge of the bed. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive heat that made her breath hitch. "But the moment you touched my wrist, you became mine. The men who attacked tonight saw you in my shadow. If I let you walk out that door, you wouldn't survive the first city block. They would use you to find me, and they would break you to do it." He leaned in, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, absolute focus. "This is the price of your life. You are dead to the streets, but you are alive here. Under my roof, under my protection, and under my thumb. You wanted to be invisible, Zuri. Now you finally are." He Penthouse was a gilded cage, but it functioned with the same clockwork demand for service as the lounge. To Dashik's men, Zuri was a ghost regained, a silent fixture in silk who moved through the expansive rooms without drawing a glance. Dashik had ordered her to serve tea during the late-night assembly in the glass-walled study, perhaps as a display of his total possession, or perhaps because he believed her mind was as vacant as the quiet waitress persona she had perfected. The air in the study was thick with the scent of bitter matcha and tension. 4 of Dashik's top lieutenants sat around a table of black obsidian, their faces grim under the cold glow of recessed lights. Zuri moved between them, her steps muffled by the plush carpet, her hands steady as she poured the vibrant green liquid into handmade ceramic bowls. She kept her chin down, her eyes focused on the steam, projecting the same hollow-eyed compliance that had kept her safe for years. They spoke in rapid-fire Korean, a linguistic shield they assumed she couldn't penetrate. Dashik sat at the head, his attention momentarily diverted by a secure phone vibrating on the table. In that brief lapse of his focus, the lieutenant to Zuri's left, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles named Chang, leaned toward his neighbor. He didn't lower his voice. He simply shifted into a specific regional dialect from the northern border, a harsh, guttural tongue meant for secrets. "The shipment at the docks tonight is a ghost," Chang whispered, his eyes fixed on his tea bowl. "The ambush is set for the second warehouse. When the boss enters, the doors lock from the outside. The Viper Syndicate is already paid." Zuri's hand didn't shake, but her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They didn't know she had spent 3 years living in a border town enclave before coming to the city, or that the harsh dialect they were using was the very one she had used to survive her own childhood. To them, she was just a beautiful, silent prop. She finished pouring the last bowl and stepped back into the shadows of the room, her expression a mask of porcelain indifference. Across the table, Dashik looked up from his phone, his sharp eyes scanning the room. For a heartbeat, his gaze caught hers, searching for any flicker of understanding. Zuri held his stare for a fraction of a second too long, her internal walls crumbling under the weight of what she knew. She wasn't just his obsession anymore. She was the only one in the room who knew he was walking into a slaughter. The invisibility she had hated was now her only weapon, but using it meant stepping out of the shadows and into the center of a war she wasn't sure she wanted to win. The transformation was completed in a silence so profound it felt like a funeral for the woman she used to be. The dress was a column of midnight blue velvet, so heavy it felt like armor, and so tight it restricted her breath to shallow, panicked sips. Dashik stood behind her in the dressing room, his reflection looming over hers in the three-way mirror. He didn't offer words of praise. Instead, he draped a necklace of raw, uncut diamonds around her throat. The stones were cold, a glittering shackle that marked her as his most prized acquisition. "Tonight," he murmured, his hands lingering on her shoulders, "you are not a ghost. You are the reason they will fear to look at me." The gala was a sea of predatory elegance, held in a ballroom that smelled of lilies and old money. As they entered, the room didn't just go quiet, it exhaled. Zuri felt the weight of 1,000 gazes, some filled with sharp curiosity, others with the venomous envy of those who understood exactly what her presence at Dashik's side signified. She was the waitress who came back from the dead, the living proof of his reach and his recklessness. Dashik kept her close, his hand never leaving the small of her back. He moved through the crowd with a terrifying, effortless power, and Zuri found herself caught in the slipstream of his authority. It was a world of absolute control, where a single nod from him could ruin a man's life or build an empire. She hated the brutality of it, the way these people bartered in blood and secrets, yet she couldn't deny the intoxicating pull of the safety he provided. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one looking for the exits. Everyone else was looking for a way to stay in his good graces. As they stood on the terrace, away from the prying eyes of the lieutenants she knew were plotting his death, the tension between them reached a breaking point. The cool night air stirred her hair, and she looked at him, really looked at him, under the pale moonlight. He was a monster, a man who had stolen her life and erased her name. But as he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch was unexpectedly tender, a jarring contrast to the violence she knew he commanded. She hated him for the cage he had built, but as his thumb brushed her lower lip, she felt a treacherous spark of desire for the man who owned the key. She was a bird trapped in velvet, beginning to forget why she had ever wanted to fly. The velvet had become a shroud. Every time Dashik touched her, every time he looked at her with that terrifying, possessive tenderness, Zuri felt the last of her own spirit eroding. She couldn't be the new queen he was building in his image. She was still the girl who wanted to be invisible, the woman who had lived by her own rules, however small. The weight of the secret she held, the betrayal brewing in the North Border dialect, felt like a hot coal in her chest, but her need for freedom outweighed her fear for his life. She moved during the gray hour, that sliver of time before dawn when the penthouse guards were at their most rhythmic and predictable. Using the service knowledge that was her only remaining weapon, she bypassed the main elevators, slipping through a ventilation maintenance hatch she'd scouted days prior. She wore her old work boots and a dark hoodie, a shadow returning to the dark. When she reached the ground floor service exit, the cool morning air hit her lungs like a shot of adrenaline. She ran. She didn't head for the main streets. She dove into the labyrinthine alleys of the garment district, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was free. But the silence of the alley wasn't empty. It was occupied. 3 men stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. They didn't wear the tailored suits of Dashik's syndicate. They wore the rugged, utilitarian leather of the Vipers. Their eyes were cold, and the sight of Zuri, the ghost waitress, sent a predatory grin across the leader's face. "The boss's favorite little bird," he rasped, his hand reaching for a serrated blade. "He'll pay anything to get you back, or maybe he'll pay just to watch you break." Zuri backed away, her heel catching on a piece of discarded rebar. Just as the lead Viper lunged, the roar of a high-performance engine tore through the alley. A black SUV drifted around the corner with surgical precision, slamming into the crates and sending the Vipers scattering. The door flew open before the vehicle even stopped. Dashik stepped out, his face a mask of such cold, incandescent rage that the Vipers froze in their tracks. He didn't look at the enemies. His eyes were fixed entirely on Zuri, who was huddled against the brick wall. In a flash of movement, his suppressed weapon coughed twice, and the alley returned to a horrifying silence. He didn't help her up. He stood over her, the scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne swirling around them. "I gave you the world, Zuri," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that was more terrifying than any shout. "And you used it to run straight into a slaughterhouse." He reached down, gripping her arm with a force that promised bruises. As he hauled her toward the car, the silence between them wasn't the quiet of the lounge or the penthouse. It was the silence of a grave. She had tried to run from his obsession, and in doing so, she had turned his love into a cold, hard surveillance. The trust was dead, and the cage was now made of iron. The ironclad silence of the penthouse didn't break. It shattered. It began with a rhythmic thud that vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of the private elevator being blown off its tracks. Then came the screams of the sophisticated security system, a high-pitched electronic wail that was quickly drowned out by the stuttering roar of automatic fire. Dashik was across the room in a heartbeat. He didn't go for the panic room. He went for the cabinet behind the black obsidian desk. He threw a compact submachine gun to Ryu's Sang men and turned to Zuri, his eyes no longer filled with the heat of obsession, but with the cold, flickering light of a man who knew he was being hunted. "The internal comms are dead," Dashik rasped, shoving her into the recessed shadow of a structural pillar as a spray of bullets turned the floor-to-ceiling windows into a rain of crystalline dust. Chang was the leak. "The secondary guard unit is held up in the basement garage, waiting for a signal that won't come. They think we're already dead." The Vipers were moving through the foyer, their boots crunching on the glass. Dashik's men were falling back, outgunned and flanked. This wasn't a fight, it was an execution. "I can get to them," Zuri whispered, her voice surprisingly steady amidst the cacophony. Dashik looked at her, his blood-stained shirt clinging to his chest. "You'll be killed before you reach the hall." "No," she said, her hands moving to the dark hoodie she had worn during her failed escape. "They're looking for you. They're looking for soldiers. They aren't looking for a shadow." She didn't wait for his approval. She moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 late-night shifts, staying low and navigating the blind spots of the room, the architectural gaps and utility corridors she had cataloged during her weeks of captivity. As Dashik and Ryu provided a thunderous distraction, Zuri slipped into the service conduit behind the kitchen. The building was a vertical labyrinth of fire and smoke. Zuri moved through the narrow maintenance stairs, her breath shallow and silent. She passed a team of Viper mercenaries in the hallway. She didn't hide. She simply stood perfectly still in the recess of a laundry chute, her dark clothing and stillness rendering her part of the wall. They ran past her, their focus entirely on the heavy doors of the penthouse. She was the invisible girl again, a ghost in the machine of a dying empire. She reached the garage level, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and damp concrete. Dashik's backup unit was pinned down behind a fleet of armored SUVs, confused and waiting for a command. When Zuri stepped out of the shadows, the lead guard nearly fired. "The North Border dialect," she gasped out, the words a frantic code. "Chang is the traitor. The penthouse is breached from the elevators. Go, now." The guards didn't hesitate. As they surged toward the stairs, Zuri leaned against a concrete pillar, her heart hammering a frantic, triumphant rhythm. She had spent her life trying to be nothing, but in the heat of the siege, her invisibility had become the only thing that was real. The garage erupted in a symphony of screeching tires and heavy caliber fire as Dashik's backup unit surged upward. Zuri followed in their wake, not as a passenger, but as a phantom haunting the edges of the conflict. The penthouse was a vision of hell, the once pristine silk wallpaper shredded by gunfire, the scent of expensive lilies drowned out by the metallic tang of blood and spent brass. In the center of the wreckage, Dashik was down on one knee behind the obsidian desk. His weapon was empty, his movement slowed by a jagged wound in his side. Standing over him, illuminated by the flickering emergency lights, was Chang. The lieutenant didn't look like a soldier, he looked like an undertaker. He held a sleek, silenced pistol leveled at Dashik's forehead, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant greed. "The king is dead," Chang spat in the harsh dialect of the border, his finger tightening on the trigger. "And I am the one who inherits the shadows." Zuri stood in the doorway, a shadow among shadows. In her hand was a heavy, discarded glass carafe she had snatched from the sideboard, the only weapon her waitress hands knew how to wield with weight. She looked at the back of Chang's head, and then she looked at Dashik. This was the moment of her true invisibility. She could turn back. She could slip into the stairwell, disappear into the city's morning fog, and leave the monster to the monster he had created. She could be Zuri again, the girl with no name and no master. But as Dashik looked up, his eyes didn't hold fear. They held a profound, tragic recognition. He wasn't looking at his killer, he was looking at her, a silent apology for the cage he had built written in his dark, depthless gaze. The choice wasn't made in her mind. It was made in her blood. Zuri lunged. She didn't scream. She moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a servant who had seen too much. The carafe shattered against the side of Chang's skull with a sickening, crystalline crack. As the traitor staggered, his shot went wide, burying itself in the leather of the chair. Before he could recover, Zuri grabbed the jagged remains of the glass and drove it into the gap in his tactical vest. It wasn't the clean, distant death of a bullet. It was messy, visceral, and permanent. As Chang collapsed, the life draining into the expensive carpet, the room went terrifyingly still. Zuri stood over the body, her hands, the hands that used to carry wine and clean linen, now stained a deep, indelible crimson. She looked at Dashik, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He reached out, his hand trembling as he gripped her forearm. It wasn't the possessive grab of a captor anymore. It was the desperate anchor of a survivor. Zuri didn't pull away. She realized then that the quiet waitress hadn't just died in the fire. She had been reborn in the iron. She had spilled blood to protect the man who obsessed over her, and in doing so, she had finally accepted the weight of the crown he had been trying to place on her head. The morning sun crept over the city skyline, but its warmth couldn't penetrate the tinted glass of the penthouse. The scent of ozone and copper still hung in the air, a lingering ghost of the night the world ended. In the center of the ruin, the obsidian desk remained, scarred by bullets but unyielding, much like the two people standing before it. Zuri stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the rising light. She was no longer wearing the charcoal satin or the midnight blue velvet. She wore a tailored black suit, the fabric crisp and the lines unforgiving. Her hair, once tied back in a simple, weary bun for her shifts at the lounge, now fell in elegant, controlled waves. Her hands were clean, the crimson stains scrubbed away, but the memory of the weight of the glass remained in her bones. Dashik sat in the chair behind the desk, his side bandaged, his face pale but his eyes burning with a new, settled intensity. He didn't look at her with the frantic obsession of a man trying to catch a shadow. He looked at her with the quiet reverence of a man who had finally seen a queen. "The lieutenants are waiting in the foyer," Dashik said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They've seen what happened to Chang. They know the vipers are broken. They're waiting to see who walks out of this room." Zuri turned away from the window. The quiet waitress who had lived for the art of being invisible was gone, buried under the rubble of the Sapphire Lounge. In her place was a woman who understood that in a world of predators, the only way to be safe was to be the one holding the leash. "Then let's not keep them waiting," Zuri replied. Her voice wasn't a melodic silk anymore. It was cold, tempered steel. She walked toward the heavy double doors, her stride confident and rhythmic. As she reached for the handles, Dashik stood, moving to walk half a step behind her. It was a subtle shift, a public acknowledgement that while he ruled the Syndicate, she ruled him. The doors swung open, and the sea of men in black suits went silent. Every eye in the hall locked onto her. Zuri didn't look down. She didn't look for a way out. She scanned the room with a calculating, intense gaze that mirrored Dashik's own, asserting a dominance that needed no explanation. She had spent her life trying to stay invisible to survive the world. Now, she would make sure the world never forgot her name. The girl from the diner was dead. The Empress of Shadows had arrived.